The casual follow-up question landed wrong, sounding less curious and more pointed than Kelly likely intended. There was a brief pause, the kind that feels longer on live television, and Zoe's smile tightened just a little. She leaned forward, folding her hands, her posture shifting from relaxed guest to someone ready to defend her ground. The audience sensed it too. The soft murmur in the studio faded as everyone waited for her response. Zoe began calmly, choosing her words with care. She talked about how actors, especially women, were often expected to package their experiences neatly, to deliver inspiration without discomfort. She explained that some topics couldn't be reduced to soundbites without losing their truth. Her tone wasn't angry, but it carried weight, a firmness that suggested years of biting her tongue in interviews just like this one. Kelly nodded at first, attempting to keep the conversation flowing, but she gently pushed back, saying that public figures also had a responsibility to answer tough questions honestly. It was meant to be balanced, maybe even supportive, but it landed like a challenge. Zoe's eyebrows lifted slightly. She inhaled, then exhaled slowly, as if steadying herself. "Honesty doesn't mean letting people frame your story for you," Zoe replied. Her voice remained measured, but the intensity was unmistakable. She spoke about moments early in her career when she felt pressured to agree with narratives she didn't believe in, just to stay employable. Each sentence felt personal, layered with frustration that had clearly been building long before she stepped onto that stage. The cameras cut briefly to the audience. Some people nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Kelly tried to lighten the mood with a half-joking comment, suggesting that live TV was always a bit unpredictable. But Zoe didn't laugh. She wasn't being rude, she simply didn't want to dilute what she was saying. She continued, explaining that shows like this had immense power in shaping public perception. A single question, she said, could reinforce stereotypes or challenge them. The responsibility wasn't only on the guest to answer gracefully, but on the host to ask thoughtfully. The words weren't accusatory, yet they hung in the air with undeniable tension. Kelly straightened in her chair. She maintained her trademark warmth, but her voice grew more serious. She clarified that her intention was never to box Zoe in, and that the show aimed to give guests space to speak freely. Still, there was a subtle defensiveness now, the kind that emerges when someone feels their professionalism is being questioned in front of millions. The exchange became a careful back and forth, polite, controlled, but charged. Zoe spoke about respect, about how conversations should feel collaborative rather than extractive. Kelly emphasized dialogue, reminding viewers that disagreement didn't mean disrespect. Each woman was articulate, confident, and unwilling to fully back down. Behind the scenes, producers were likely scrambling, watching the clock, signaling for a transition. The band sat still, waiting for cues that didn't come. Even the applause sign felt forgotten. This wasn't the kind of dramatic moment that involved shouting or insults, it was sharper than that. It was two strong voices colliding in real time, neither wanting to oversimplify a complicated truth. Zoe paused mid-sentence, then added something quieter but more piercing. She said that she'd agreed to come on the show to talk about her work, not to defend her right to define herself. The studio went almost silent. You could hear the faint hum of the lights overhead. Kelly responded with a measured smile, acknowledging Zoe's point, but also reminding her that audiences tuned in for honesty and vulnerability. She suggested that these moments, however uncomfortable, were part of meaningful conversation. Her words were diplomatic, yet the distance between them felt wider now. Zoe leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable. She nodded once, slowly, as if absorbing Kelly's response. For a split second, it seemed like the tension might ease, that they'd find a middle ground and move on. But then Zoe spoke again, her voice softer, almost tired. Meaningful conversation, she said, only works when both sides feel heard. That single line carried more emotion than anything she'd said so far. It wasn't confrontational, it was weary, honest, and deeply human. The audience reacted with a ripple of applause, spontaneous and supportive, breaking the heavy silence. Kelly thanked her for sharing that perspective, but the segment had clearly veered far from its original plan. The energy was no longer light or promotional, it was raw and unscripted. Zoe offered a small, polite smile, but her eyes suggested she was ready for the conversation to end. As the camera pulled back and Kelly attempted to segue to the next topic, the tension lingered. It was clear that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the interview, but in the room itself. What began as a friendly daytime chat had transformed into a serious, emotionally charged exchange, leaving everyone wondering how it would end once the cameras stopped rolling. As the cameras cut to commercial, the studio didn't immediately relax the way it usually did. There was no sudden burst of chatter, no easy laughter from the crew. Instead, everything felt suspended, like the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Kelly took a sip of water, her eyes briefly scanning the cue cards she hadn't needed until now. Zoe sat still, hands resting in her lap, gaze focused somewhere beyond the stage lights. When the show returned from the break, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. The music cue was shorter. Kelly's voice, when she welcomed viewers back, was calm but more formal than before. She turned toward Zoe with a practiced smile, yet there was a careful distance in her posture. This was no longer a casual interview, it was damage control, live and unscripted. Kelly attempted to redirect the conversation toward Zoe's latest project, praising her performance and emphasizing her long-standing impact in the industry. For a moment, it worked. Zoe responded politely, professionally, speaking about the creative process and the importance of representation in storytelling. But the earlier tension hadn't vanished, it sat just beneath the surface, influencing every word, every pause. Then Kelly mentioned how audiences loved seeing the real side of celebrities, framing vulnerability as a gift to viewers. The line was gentle, almost complimentary, but Zoe's expression shifted again. She didn't interrupt. She waited, letting Kelly finish, then nodded slowly. "I agree," Zoe said, "but vulnerability should be an invitation, not a requirement." The words weren't loud, but they carried. A few audience members clapped instinctively, then stopped, unsure if it was appropriate. Kelly hesitated, clearly weighing her next response. She smiled, thanked Zoe for that insight, and tried once more to steer the conversation forward. But by now, the rhythm was gone. The easy back and forth that usually defined the show felt fractured. Behind the scenes, producers were signaling more urgently. Time was slipping, and the segment was no longer predictable. Kelly acknowledged the signals with a quick glance, then turned back to Zoe. "I want this to be a safe space," Kelly said, her voice sincere. "And I don't ever want a guest to feel cornered." Zoe met her gaze. For a long second, neither spoke. When Zoe finally responded, her tone was calm but resolute. "Then listening matters just as much as asking," she said. That was the moment the atmosphere shifted from tense to decisive. It wasn't an argument anymore, it was a boundary being drawn. Kelly nodded, but her smile faded slightly. She thanked Zoe again, a little too quickly, and announced that they'd be moving on. The band began to play, earlier than scheduled. The applause followed, uneven and confused. Zoe stood,